lot of really smart thinking about where things are going. The marriage of typical hardware to the software platforms that are starting to create new business models and new opportunities for a diverse group of players in the space. How it compares to the oil and gas side, um, I can say that you get really quite similar skill sets. People that are focused and understand and are comfortable with long-term complexity, long-term uncertainty, and using certain tools and also, I guess, a certain mentality to manage and be comfortable with the complexity.
Do you think, I think this is a, I think, question that I not necessarily asked everyone, but I think it's quite a very important one. Do you need to have energy background to be investing in the space? And I think I personally think you do to some extent, maybe, but it's very different to do being a very generic VC.
I think it helps, Rokas. Maybe understanding the nuances of the technology and the market spaces that they're selling into, understanding how the complex works sort of at the macro level, I think is super helpful so that when trends emerge and look promising or viable, you can sort of recognize those. At the same time, though, I think a diversity of thought and background is always important. You just get really good perspectives, new ways of thinking, um, and I think it really helps to have that perspective and perhaps see trends or see new dynamics that you might not have seen because your mind has been shaped a certain way for so long.
Mm. And yeah, so after this, you find yourself in Chevron, right? So coming from your career to now Chevron, what your current role, um, how what do you guys, maybe just a general overview for viewers and people that are going to watch this later? What is Chevron Energy Ventures? And you have a very interesting name that determines the purpose of your investing, I think. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've been at Chevron since late 2008. So in those roughly 12 years, I've spent most of my time within Chevron Technology Ventures, and also some of that time out in the core parts of the business, mainly looking at power markets and the interaction of fuels inside of those power markets. But within CTV, we started about 20 plus years ago purely as venture focused on the oil and gas on the core business technologies. We evolved since then to include three technology teams. So we have a team that looks at water and advanced materials, another team that looks at conventional oil and gas technologies, and a third team that looks at digital technologies across the value chain. And the remit of those three groups is essentially to scout good technologies and do validation projects with an eye toward moving those out into our core business. Um, but also in June of 2018, we stood up our Future Energy Fund, which is where I sit, which is a $100 million fund. Um, and we're trying to really get at how to lower the emissions of oil and gas and access technologies critical for lower carbon value chains.
Mm.
And so, within the fund, we typically target Series A and B, and sometimes go a little bit later or earlier as the situation warrants. Um, and then our typical check size is kind of in that $2 to $6 million range that you'd expect in that stage, and we're a non-lead investor, so we ask for board observer rights, but we generally just stick to that mantra. And then from a thesis perspective, our main pillars of investment are macro decarbonization, the mobility energy nexus, and energy decentralization.
And so from a geography point of view, you mainly focused in US. I think that's where Chevron primarily is based from like a business perspective. Obviously, we have some downstream and upstream assets outside, but primarily still is US. Do you look at companies outside of US?
Yeah, so from our core oil and gas fund, as well as our future energy fund, I'd say that the preponderance of investments are in North America. I would not say that we're limited to North America. We have investments in Europe as well, and so we'll continue to, I think, maintain that geographic focus going forward.
So from your future fund, so it's 100 million fund, right? And you started investing like 2 years ago, and for like Chevron Technology Ventures, that's a way older sort of a fund that you've been investing from. And is maybe for people that are looking to understand better where they fit in terms of the bucket when they approach Chevron, what do you think is Chevron Technology Ventures is a balance sheet vehicle? It's also a dedicated fund, but more like an evergreen fund. And that's more oil and gas, right? And then the future fund is obviously determining where, but with the future of Chevron, so it's a bit more focused on other necessarily non-core areas.
Yeah, I think that's right. The future of Chevron, and also just the future of the energy complex.
Mm,
What activities and technologies and business models are out there that are leading toward a lower carbon uh, energy use and
mm,
energy production, of course.
mm. So from coming back a bit to your personal side of things, when looking at investments, what do you primarily look for? Both from like a personal, what are the key determinants that you look in the team or a company?
Yeah, so I think foremost for us is that we really want to find that right intersection of technology and business model. We're not looking for really just one or the other, but we want to say look out on the 5 year horizon and assess where these technologies fit, where they create potential for disruption or, let's say, dislocation of existing business models in the space. And so that intersection is really important to us. Of course, as with any investor, we look at the management team and we want to see a solid team with a really good and dedicated vision of where their technology fits and how they plan to execute.
Is there has to be a strategic angle that is, I think, one of the top priorities, or that sometimes financial is more in favor, or it's a mixture of both, you would say?
I think, Rokas, it's a mixture, but
Mm,
we want to. I mean, yes, in some cases, companies will feed our value chain. It's not necessarily a guarantee, but obviously, when you're looking at strategic investments, you're thinking about where companies can eventually fit within the enterprise and our operations and our businesses.
mm,
Um, the question of financial returns is one of, I think you have to develop really good conviction on an investment, and the financial return obviously plays a role in developing that personal conviction.
mm. Okay. So how many investments you've done since you launched 2 years ago? And maybe you have your favorite, or you want to pick a company that you think is one of the most interesting ones. I know it's hard to pick one. Maybe instead, if you don't want to pick a company, maybe pick a technology that is, I think, you most interesting that you're currently maybe looking at or you invested.
Yeah, so we've made about 9 investments since we started on the future energy side, and they are pretty well balanced across the three pillars that I mentioned: decarbonization, mobility, energy nexus, and energy decentralization. I don't think picking favorites is the way I would put it. I think we have great conviction on everything we do, and the entrepreneurs that we work with are really focused, and they're doing exciting things. Um, we've made investments, for example, in energy storage, where we're trying to look at it perhaps a little bit differently, from a sense of, okay, are there additional chemistries that we can explore for various uses? And so we've made it an investment, for example, um, in Natron Energy, which is a sodium ion battery that has a particularly novel electrode material. And so what they're looking for is very long-term stability. And so this is a battery which is geared toward um, high power, right? And so long life cycle, high power, um, through the electrode chemistry, being able to just maintain mechanical stability through the long cycle life of the technology. And so that's interesting and leads to a lot of thinking about use cases and problem sets that you can address.
Hmm. And actually, one thing that I did not actually ask before when we were speaking about the fund, do you guys back both hardware and software, or is there any particular focus on one or the other, or that really depends more on the opportunity?
No, it's really depends on the opportunity. I would say that our portfolio as it stands today is predominantly in the hardware space, but that's not necessarily by design. I think that we're certainly looking at a number of platform type plays as well.
Hmm. So I think that comes to my next question. I think, the clean tech space, we're fortunate, I think, is kind of increasing in terms of, I think, curiosity from other investors. It's very clear, what strategic value you guys bring, being one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world. Uh, what do you think is your sort of unique sort of selling point that entrepreneurs that you would kind of communicate over taking money from a traditional generalist fund, maybe preferring money over valuation instead of like having a strategic angle? How do you differentiate it when you, let's say it's a super crowded round and you want to get in, it's a great technology, great entrepreneur. What's kind of your take on it, how you present yourselves?
Yeah, good question, Rokas. And I would say that we value partnership, and we hope that those that we're investing in and working with value strong partnership as well. Um, CTV has, as I mentioned, a 20 plus year history of doing things the right way, and Chevron itself has a 140-year history and reputation of leading in areas of corporate citizenship and environmental stewardship. We believe that we're smart, creative people who bring our corporate reputation to bear in every deal that we do.
And you usually, so from sort of beyond the fund, do you engage with your technical teams? Do you try to work with the teams directly after investment, even sometimes before the investment? Um, what sort of like, because obviously you have the infrastructure, you have the know-how, all those thousands of people that are, employees of Chevron. How engaged you become when you invest, or it really depends again from the team?
I mean, I think the main answer is yes. We engage across our enterprise. We have a lot of focus areas that are very helpful to us. Really smart scientists, engineers, business people that can really help us assess both technology and market space. And I think that relationship persists post investment too, in the sense that you know we sort of bring um, our broader group of thinking into that dialogue with the entrepreneurs that we invest in.
And you mentioned that you guys are not necessarily a lead investor in most instances. Are you fine to co-invest with, let's say, your competitors? Let's say if, I don't know, Shell or BP is looking to invest in the same company, or you consider that as a value added? Or again, I think it can be two sides of the story, right? It really depends on the company. But do you have a view on that?
Yeah, no hard and fast view. I would say that we have a long and very positive history of co-investing alongside our peer group.
Hmm. Okay. So now picking up to the most exciting part, I think, the current situation. I think I don't even know where to start what to speak about beyond, I guess, energy markets. But I think for today, we're going to stick to those only. But uh, what's kind of, obviously when you look at, investment opportunities, you still probably have a couple of trends in mind that are most exciting, and you want to look and be following and subsequently investing from the future energy fund. Would you elaborate what would be those, let's say, two or three themes that you believe are at the core of it, where you focus now and you will probably likely be looking to invest over the next couple of years?
Yeah, Rokas, I think to sort of peel the onion, it's probably more instructive for listeners if I kind of look at the
Hmm.
macro level.
Yeah.
And so from that, let's say macro standpoint, within energy and its adjacent verticals such as power, um, automotive, transport, industrial, all of those are undergoing significant change. And it's a change in terms of how products and services look, how work is defined, and and so on. For oil and gas, there's a sharp focus on emissions, the recycling of CO2, and energy efficiency. Um, what this translates to is a great diversity of energy sources and of course disruption across the value chain. Um, it means the establishment of new business models, which again are part and parcel of what we're looking at from an investment theme standpoint. And so much of this activity will be within the energy sector and its adjacent verticals. Um, they're all undergoing notable change, and it means you know continued big changes. And if you look at that going forward, the challenge, I suppose, is to really take those trends and connect the dots on what might not appear typical, and again, being comfortable with that uncertainty. Um, Within the power sector, for example, we've seen the emergence of non-utility players into the space. We've seen the overlay of data and digitization on the conventional power value chains. We've seen very novel approaches toward just straight decarbonization, um, both from, let's say, just a pure steel in the ground standpoint, as well as looking at platforms and software type approaches that really are focused on decarbonization of the energy complex. Um, I think that what enables this, of course, is innovative technologies. There are policies and business models that are intersecting, and so this is, in my mind, a story of convergence of those factors. We've seen data getting cheaper and more ubiquitous, more easily managed, more easily transported. Um, we've seen excellent engineering on the hardware side with a keen focus on reducing emissions. Um, of course, there's the distributed power angle, which is a whole new paradigm in the sense that you have two-way power flows to a load center, both obviously from the grid and from downstream of the consumer. But also there's the sort of the storage, let's say, wild card in there, which kind of gives you a third dimension, and then the digital layer on top of that, managing how all of those things are optimized. And so um, these are these are of course important trends, but they're not um, let's say they're not siloed. They're not in isolation. I really have tried to recognize and act upon the fact that this is really a convergence of factors. We're kind of at an inflection point driven by convergence.
Mm. And how do you think, I mean, these are, I think you mentioned quite a few technologies, different ones, and you mentioned in kind of layers. It's always becomes a sort of like an egg and a chicken problem, right? What comes first? Clearly some of those are more driven by demand and supply, like such as, solar was first, and now you have, you know, change in the consumption, and then therefore you need the batteries to balance the grid. And also you mentioned digitalization, and then also emergence of new entrants to the sector that I think it's something that is driving a lot through technology availability, like cloud technology availability, that is now that making the timing correct. So do you think let's say if we drill down to one specific theme, right? You are a fully integrated oil and gas company, right?
Hmm.
What's kind of the most logical sense to enter the power market? Is it through generation? That kind of seemed to be the earliest one. Or, someone would ask, what is it through storage? And the third question is maybe it's through technology completely without even having these assets, right? And you have an ability to invest in these companies, are driving that, and then maybe the hardware element is just a commodity, same way it was oil is a commodity, right? But technology ultimately is the business model that will enhance most value. What's kind of your take on that? Where does the hardware software you know elements sit between and from your importance for your business? It's a tough
So
one question. I think I asked too many things in one go.
yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. I think you said, where do you kind of enter the electricity space? And I think
Mm.
that, you know,
Is it
I think
through
over the
asset
long,
or is it more through technology? I think that's the simplification of that question, even.
I think it's different approaches for different companies and
Mm.
different objectives. In one sense, all of us in our peer group have been in the power space for a really long time, perhaps since inception, right?
Mm.
The operations of oil and gas have generally been heavy on electrical power, and so we've we've all had an understanding of how power fits into our operations. There's of course different approaches beyond, let's say, venture investment, where you can perhaps build or pick up an asset class, and then there's more, let's say, hybrid approaches. Let's call them adjacent approaches, where you can really start to get back to that decarbonization theme, that internal decarbonization theme, and think about how increased renewables, increased optimization, the balancing of supply and demand with buffers such as storage, can play a key role. And so I don't know that I could isolate a theme there. I think that there's there's really different ways of attacking this transition depending on the company, where they're set up geographically, and how they're set up as an enterprise.
Mm. Uh, Going into more, I think today's, maybe yesterday's now question, uh, you know, and it happened obviously in nowhere else but Texas, WTI went negative, and the question is more not about the oil price, but it's more about the question, uh, everyone raised it in a way. Is there any impact from like some events like that to our sustainable energy transition? Does it accelerate or does it, maybe slow it down? And that's probably in the wake of COVID, something that we never experienced as well before. Um, both
Well,
these two shocks, I think, are completely phenomenal in their own capacity.
yeah, as you allude to, this is a to put it mildly, this is a unique experience. It's a convergence of,
Mm.
let's call it a perfect storm of these two big macro factors, right? COVID and the oil price, let's say, wars. So where that leads for decarbonization, I mean, I don't know that I detect any perceptible change among the peer group in terms of ambition and goals and efforts. I mean, these companies have always been set up on extremely long planning cycles. They're used to very large and expensive projects that demand long planning cycles and
Mm.
thoughtfulness about the uncertainty ahead. So my own sense, my personal sense, is that these macro factors kind of live in the microcosm of this year and maybe a little bit beyond. But you know, all of our peer group, and let's say the oil and gas sector is
Mm.
really planning on long term efforts and activities.
Mm. Do you think that's going to have an impact to startups that are innovating in the space? Maybe, again, it's very hard question and very open, but obviously directing to, did you guys looked at companies differently? Like, I think there was speculation about valuations and things like that. or you think it's just something that it was a shock and that passes? And again, you mentioned it's we're looking at longer terms. Do you see any, I think, events that you would think would have an impact to the companies, maybe?
Um, I don't know. I mean, in terms of prognostication, it's probably not my my strong point.
Yeah.
Um, I can point back though to 2008 in that financial crisis, and what I think started to happen was that a lot of liquidity tended to dry up, especially in the clean tech space, and so that had a pronounced impact on investment. Let's say from, of course, the venture private equity side, but also on the project side. Um, a lot of, let's say, the renewable projects were pretty heavily predicated on the tax equity, and so when you had such a shocking and sudden liquidity crisis, it caused a lot of that liquidity, of course, to come um, out of those project finance
Mm.
opportunities. So, um, I think all we can do is keep our ear to the ground and look for similarities and kind of milestones that mimic or diverge from what happened the last time.
I think there's been, this is something that I think I perceived, and I had one conversation that I participated in, and it was like the question was always addressed: is it a good time to build a company? What do you think? I think it's a good time to build a company anytime if you have a problem and you have a solution to address that problem. But and there's obviously history that says, a lot of companies back in dot-com bubble, Google was built, Facebook was built, and then subsequently, WhatsApp, Instagram in 2008, post factum. What about energy? What do you think personally? I mean, it's not something to probably forecast, but more so, is it a good time to build a company, like timing wise, in a wake of all these events happening and maybe,
I mean, I kind of share your view that the timing is somewhat irrelevant. Leaving the financing aside, I think that the
hmm,
timing is somewhat irrelevant as long as you can put a strong team together with strong conviction about a problem or problem set that you can meaningfully address. Um, I don't know how else to tackle that question. I think that um, a lot of these funds, have a pretty long-term investment horizon, and so we'll see if evidence develops of, let's see, either lack of liquidity or just general pullback um, in the space, from both financial and institutional investors.
hmm,
Excuse me, strategic investors.
hmm. And yeah, so I think we're gonna go to some of the audience questions to address that, because I see that there's quite a few of them, and then we'll come back to a couple more specific questions that I have that I always ask each of the people that we speak to. Um, so one of the questions, it'd be interested to hear your opinion on corporate ventures versus traditional venture capital. Do you believe that big corporates are flexible enough to play in such a fast-paced environment?
Flexible. It's not totally obvious to me how flexibility factors into the equation. Um,
Mm.
I think that
Maybe
on the one
this is
hand,
maybe a good question to maybe rephrase a bit. I think sometimes people, which I don't, because I know a bunch of people that we co-invest together with, perceive corporates as being slow. Therefore, the flexibility of, like, I'm discussing a term sheet and people perceive it's going to take like 3 months. So I think that's a good time to really disagree with that, and I think you're the best one to probably address even of everyone, of all the corporates I think I spoke to.
yeah, I mean, I perhaps couldn't speak for all corporates. I could say for ourselves that we have
Yeah.
a pretty defined process, and um, we try to set expectations, and I think we do a really good job of level setting and maintaining that ongoing dialogue, both with the entrepreneurs and with the co-investors. And so I don't know that I would characterize uh, corporates necessarily as slow moving with a broad brush.
Hmm. Okay. Another question I think that comes up when we spoke with one of the speakers, one of the first sessions, we spoke a lot about hydrogen. One question is exactly about that: hydrogen versus batteries. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. I think for me to add to it is like obviously depends on the use case, but what broadly are you interested in hydrogen as a space, and maybe where specifically in use cases versus the batteries, like traditional lithium-ion batteries, let's say, not picking on any other chemistries or technologies.
Yeah, so I think general interest, yes. I can point to the fact that Chevron has joined the Hydrogen Council.
Mm,
Um, from an investment standpoint, we obviously see the activity, we see the trends, and we see, let's say, the time horizons that hydrogen's on. And so, I would characterize it as we're really thinking hard about where it goes. Um, the I think that the idea of hydrogen versus batteries, frankly, is too general.
mm,
My opinion is that there's an over tendency to look at batteries as kind of a monolithic player in the complex. Um, and it's until now it's really been focused on intermittency. But what we're seeing experientially is that you're seeing a lot of, for example, targeted approaches of energy storage, which are getting after um, not only the temporal aspects of providing a storage buffer, but also the locational aspects. And so I think there's emerging at least academic thinking about this convergence of these various factors: locational, temporal,
mm,
let's say situational, size, energy, um, so that it doesn't look monolithic. And so I think um, that hydrogen and electrochem storage are both going to find market areas where they fit best, especially as things evolve and as loads and supplies get more distributed.
mm. And do you think what's the kind of first use cases? I think steam reforming is something that is one type of hydrogen extraction ways, right? And it's used mostly in oil and gas industry. Do you believe in green hydrogen being kind of a, let's say, one of the drivers in let's say refinery applications as an example? Um,
Well, I think to the extent that it plays a role in decarbonization, I think it can start to play that role. I do think it's a fairly long term story in the sense that
mm,
there's a lot of effort going into the electrolyzer technology and how that plays out. Um, but by all means, to the extent that you have low carbon energy carriers, I think that's of interest to all of us.
mm. And you mentioned you guys joined the as Chevron, you joined the hydrogen. Is it like a consortium? Is it like what's kind of the engagement there? I forgot what the name was you mentioned. It's could you
The
elaborate more on
hydrogen
that? Yeah,
the hydrogen council.
yeah, hydrogen cancel.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it's I'd say I'd characterize it as um, a group of companies that are interested in the thinking or advancing the thinking about hydrogen and progressing um, the ideal of how hydrogen can start to play into broader decarbonization efforts.
Hmm.
Um, and so,
Is it
in
like a
addition,
collaboration? Is it only investors, or is it also like companies, technologies, universities, like broad base of different players?
yeah, the latter.
Hmm.
And in addition, we're also members of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative,
Hmm.
which is in a similar vein. There's an investment component there, but there's also an activity component where you're actually engaging with technologies, doing the early projects to try to advance the low carbon technologies as well. And so that looks like a consortium of companies like ourselves.
Hmm. Um, there's one question that is kind of picking more in like Chevron investment strategy, but I think you answered that. I'll shape the question a bit differently. Um, like, specifically future fund. Do you think uh, is it likely for me to characterize that you're trying to find technologies that define the next 20, 30 years of Chevron, or is it trying to again be more broader basis to to maybe put the strategy in action, or is it already kind of implementing the strategy, or is it a bit of both? um,
I would say just like I characterized it earlier, we're really just looking at low carbon approaches, right? We're
mm,
looking at ways to effectively decarbonize many of the activities within our complex.
okay. um, Yeah, so I actually don't have any more additional questions from the crowd. So I have two questions that I always ask the speakers. And the first one is, how do I, if I'm a startup, like a very ambitious Series A startup, trying to knock on the doors of Chevron, what's the best way for me to find you, Jesse, or anyone from your team? How do you guys source, and what's the best way to meet you, or have a chat with you if I believe I'm relevant, A, or I should be a company that wants to partner with Chevron?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rokas. And I know that you and I have run into each other at a number of events, and so we tend to meet people that way, of course. But one way to surely get attention is to have a really rock solid story and conviction on your technology and a clear understanding of your market space, and then get out there and talk about it in public forums,
Mm,
and of course folks like us take notice of that. And I really think that's the best way. It's great when we get out there as investors and we see something and we see somebody
I think in that, I'm sure you get, hundreds of outbounds every day probably, but timing is very crucial element when thinking of approaching an investor, right? Because the first sort of impression is sometimes very important one. Do you like to, maybe it's a wrong thing to say, do you like to, but do you prefer meeting the teams way early on before you make a decision to invest, and really like, you know, understand them, or if there are situations where you can do a deal in 1 month, right? Maybe COVID
yeah.
is a good example where people did deals without meeting the teams. And but what's kind of your average, I would say, interaction with a team when you to make a decision to invest in
Yeah, Rokus, I was going to turn that on its head as well and say that that's kind of the COVID question, but you beat me to that.
them?
Um, I would say in the pre-COVID era, there really was a desire to personally meet the teams, in some cases several times, to really just um, develop a relationship, because that both pre and post investment, that relationship is going to be perhaps the most important feature of the investment, right? Without that rock solid relationship and understanding, it can be very hard over the long term. And so, yeah, we've always tried to meet the entrepreneurs and spend real time with them, understanding not just the business and not just the technology, but who they are, um, how they're thinking broadly about markets, what their level of conviction is on certain areas, and how they plan to execute. Now, in this era, in this somewhat unprecedented climate that we're in, I think it tests that model. And so, the good news is that after the 1450th Zoom meeting that we've had, I think that we are. I think that the screen is becoming less of a membrane between people, right?
Yeah.
And we're gaining increasing comfort with the relationships that are developed via video conference. And so I think that broadly, I think that you'll see more and more comfort with folks executing deals without having a physical meeting. Um, but once this is over, hopefully soon, I do expect somewhat of a return to both entrepreneurs and investors wanting to get out there and keep developing those personal relationships. um, I think the one limitation of the screen is that you know you and I, for example, met in New York, and
Yeah,
we both probably met a few dozen other people just by turning our heads left and right at the time, right?
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
and so the problem with the screen, of course, is that it's generally mono channel, and you
yeah.
can't really turn left and right. All I can see is my backyard if I do that. And so
Hmm.
you do miss that element of, and you miss that multiplier effect of getting out there and meeting folks. And I do deeply miss that interpersonal connection.
Hmm. And sort of, I think that briefly touches upon where we're probably going. And what do you think is partially, what do you think, what two things basically, what do you want to wish to entrepreneurs, given that we're having so many different things? There's like everyone's joking, what else is 2020 going to give us, right? but but what do you wish to them in this kind of, let's say, unclear, undefined maybe time? And especially, we did this, let's say, one-on-one sessions with investors for people to better learn about investors, because you want to knock the door that is the right door, and you want to understand that if you knock, the other person is going to open, because you're the relevant person to be knocking on the door. If you're in looking for an oil and gas investor, you can go to Chevron Technology Ventures. If you want to look for like future, they know where to go. Jesse is running the future energy fund, so I think he's learning and more informed, right? So what do you wish for them to do it maybe differently, or what's your thought on there should be more collaboration? People should like seek for other ways of meeting people. I think this is becoming less and less relevant question, because we're kind of going to normal, whether that's the new normal or the normal, we'll see. And it's hard to probably understand, but there's still a lot of uncertainty from entrepreneurs. We're trying to raise money at the same time. There's so much uncertainty from a client side, from maybe investor side. What's your sort of biggest thought to, or maybe a wish to them in this road?
Yeah, and I assume that's directed at sort of this post-COVID environment, right?
Yeah,
How
yeah.
how should they navigate? And first of all, I wish them every success in all of this. My hope is that they can keep their heads down, um, blur out the distractions, and just keep focusing on innovation and on their roadmaps. I understand it's harder to find capital via these personal connections, and so it perhaps puts a greater emphasis on both utilizing and relying and leaning upon your networks, but also, again, what I said before, finding the fora to get out there and tell your stories.
Mm,
Um, it looks like those fora are virtual at the moment, but there are plenty of them out there.
mm,
Um, Practically every conference that I've attended in person has now moved to a virtual format, with some exceptions. But finding ways to really keep telling that story, and of course elevating the conversation, right? And it means perhaps not focus on what this environment looks like, but a focus on what are the convergence trends, what are the macro factors, what's the medium term view that's going to make a technology or a business model really make sense.
mm. No, it's great. I think people should, focus. That's, I think what you said is very important. Focus. Don't get onto the distractions, and really build what you were meant to do at the first place. Build the technology and best team at this point in time. I think it's also a great thing that, there's always negatives and positives, but there's just change how we work in general. Maybe tap into talents that you were not even capable of thinking that you can hire a remote team with a different skill set. Maybe that even becomes your even expansion strategy to post COVID when everything completely gets to normal. So very good thoughts to the entrepreneurs. So I think we're running out of time. It's been an absolute pleasure, Jesse, to have you here and also talk more about your personal career, your views on the market, as well as learn more about Chevron Energy Ventures. And I think a lot of people appreciate that and this information that you today communicated to them. And I hope is gonna also drive more very smart and successful entrepreneurs go your way that specifically want to have Chevron as their partner and investor.
We hope so, and thank you as well, Rokas. It's great to see you again, and appreciate the dialogue as always. We always have such good chats, and I'm glad that
Yeah,
we were able to do this today and share it with others, and really thank you.
very much looking forward to see you in person soon as well. I
I
hope
hope
this
so too.
happens soon. I hope this
I do
happens
too.
soon. Cool. Thanks a lot, and have a good rest of the day because I know it's still quite early on for you.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
for everyone else, we're gonna tune in tomorrow with another session. Yeah, and we're gonna have another session on Thursday. So the typical days. Since we're coming back to Europe, we're gonna do the standard time at 3 p.m. CET. Thanks a lot for everyone who tuned in, and you can also reach Jesse in the Brella platform. So feel free to reach out to him if you have building a great company and you want to seek for finance or you want to just chat with him and introduce. Thanks everyone, and again, Jesse.
Thanks, Rokas. Take care.